So when we started Just Funded, we did our research, and together actually with, I think you're hearing from Raise Your Hand next week, they've been a partner on some of this. They've got some great research and some great graphics, but we looked, and according to Education Week's annual survey, we were 43rd in per student funding. So this is Texas, out of 50 states. We like to be number one. We were about $4,000 behind the national average. We're paying about 2/3 per student. And so I will add that if you actually just looked at how much Texas was paying per student, we'd be 49th. But because we're more equitable, because we do have Robin Hood system, we got like an F in straight out funding and a B in equity, and that bumped us up to 43rd. So that 43rd is accounting for us distributing from some of the property wealthy districts to the less property wealthy districts. So that was the situation in November 2018. We got together, started Just Funded, and said, look, after what we'd seen, the legislature had been extremely effective in sort of pitting rich against poor, urban against rural, large against small. And while we were paying a ridiculous amount in, other districts were getting money, but basically what they do is they take the money, they shake it up, they suck some off, and we're going to talk about that and don't use it in education, and then nobody gets enough. So we said, look, we're not going to fight over the scraps. We're going to argue that every kid deserves better, and that every one of the 5.5 million kids in Texas public schools deserves to be better than 43rd in per student funding. And I will also put that in perspective. Like our state pays, I think it's the second highest expenditure is public ed. Public ed and public health cost a lot. I mean, if we did decide to take the Medicaid money, I'm not going to go there. We're talking about education today. But we spend on other stuff. We're spending 3 times as much to incarcerate each person than we are to educate them. And that this is appalling. And these figures I pulled together a year or two ago, but it's still the same ratio. And they're, the better you educate people and the less we push them from the school to prison pipeline, the fewer people we put in prison, but we are spending money on some things. And this should make people mad, if nothing else. So this was a slide from going in. And so one thing that Austin does get, it's the largest payer of recapture. And the way it works is as our property taxes rise in local property taxes, the state would pay less. So in 2008, it was almost half and half. And then by 2019, it was, 62% was coming from our local tax dollars, and the state wasn't really paying their share. So we said, we need you to pay more of your share. We're going to look at House Bill 3. They did start paying more of their share, but it didn't grow the pie all that much. So you can't just say we want you to pay your share. We do send the most back to our state, and we do pay. It did reduce our recapture a little bit with House Bill 3, but we still rely a lot on property tax. And so in 2011, when we had when we had a recession, they balanced the budget on the back of Texas kids, and we need to make sure they're not going to do that again this session. So that is going to be a big talking point. I'm going to talk for a minute about recapture and how it works, because it's confusing and we do pay a lot. And the reason we pay a lot is the way the formula goes. And this is how we tie together some of the issues we're going to talk about. So the formula is pretty straightforward. It's the number of students enrolled divided by the property value of your taxable area. So as each child leaves to either go to a pod and not enroll in school, gets gentrified out of the city, chooses to go to a charter, that number in the numerator goes down. On the bottom is our property tax value. And our property tax rate is lower than a lot of districts. A lot of districts are taxing at the highest rate, but they don't have a lot of taxable value. They don't have appreciating property. So they're taxed out all the way, but they can't raise any more money. Meanwhile, our property values are through the roof. So our denominator is going up, right? So if your numerator is smaller and your denominator is bigger, your number of wealth per child looks higher. So you pay more back to the state. So that is why our recapture keeps going up. And so it's important to each kid that goes to a charter. It's important to each kid that does not enroll this year. And what else was I going to say on this one? So our money is going in. It is going straight in, and they're not looking at, when they say wealth, they're not talking about wealth of the students. We have more and more economically disadvantaged students. We have more and more emerging bilingual students, special ed students. They haven't changed those formulas, I believe, since the 80s. I think Edna's on, she can talk to that later too, but they haven't changed that, but it's costing more and more to educate our children while we are sending more back. And again, it's not all going into public ed. This slide talks to that. The fact that money raised for public education should be spent on education. And I think taxpayers naturally think that money that says public education would go to public ed. But there's no law that says money raised for public education stays in education. And so this biennium, $3.7 billion raised for education went to fund other things. Could have been anything. And so Donna Howard, who again is a fantastic local rep, she every session has proposed a bill saying money raised for education should stay in education. I think she and or Kirk Watson had a bill saying 50% of funding should come from the state. Neither of those have been heard, neither have been passed. I mean, if the House changes hands, maybe we would hear these and they would pass. We're going to get to voting a little bit later, but these are important things that people don't know. Okay, hold on. The other thing here, let me go back one. Oh, I can't go back. So let's hope I don't need to go back. When we had got just funded and they were starting to hear House Bill 3. So people voted, the legislature heard that it was time to talk about funding. And they had different proposals out there in the last legislative session. The House had proposed like $5 or $6 billion, and the Senate maybe 3. And then the House Democratic Caucus said, well, maybe 14. And we went around as just funded and said, look, we really appreciate you talking about funding our schools. We really do. We know nobody's done it for a long, long time, but we need you to understand that this has to be a long-term process, because if we wanted to be average, keep in mind we're 43rd. If we wanted to get to average, it would take $44 billion this biennium. And people just said, I beg your pardon? We said, no, we really appreciate it. We know you're doing a lot. We know $5 billion's a lot, $6 billion's a lot, but we're super far behind. So it was a reality check. And I think we said what we're asking you for is either an inflationary factor or for you to commit to making this a long-term plan. I mean, COVID came and we're going to see that. So it's going to be hard to make a lot of headway this session, but just keeping in mind, we're 43rd, we're still 43rd. So this is what happened with House Bill 3. We did get closer to 42nd. When every legislator pats themselves on the back and says we had transformative change, we did get a lot more money than we ever have before, but it literally got us closer to 42nd. Like, we're way behind. So a total of $14.2 billion was put in there. $5 billion went to property tax relief. A lot of the numbers along the bottom are super important. Special ed, still not enough. Money for teachers, still not enough. School safety, but the $6.5 billion was for school funding. And that's what raised the basic allotment. I think the next slide says on average about $600 per kid. I mean, we're still 4,000 behind. And as we moved up, all the other states moved up too. So it's definitely progress, and we super appreciate it. And it was the first real increase in a long, long time. But it gets us back to where we were when we lost that $5 billion, the last time. So we're not done. This session will be about cutting. And so this session, we're going to have to fight to keep what we have and say, we've done a lot, don't mess with public ed. So this is the sort of post-mortem. Where are we after? Well, there is more for kids. We're still 43rd, but it still would have to invest a lot more money to bring us to the national average. So then enters COVID, right? So we're already underfunded. The president, the governor, everyone's sort of playing politics with this. Go back to school, COVID's a thing, it's not a thing, we'll fund you, we won't fund you. We're gonna fund you if you show up, we're not gonna fund you, we're gonna fund you if the health professionals say it's okay. I mean, whiplash. Our superintendents and our school boards have worked nonstop trying to follow the changes. And these are political changes. These were not necessarily changes grounded in what is best for children and what is best for teachers. Meanwhile, there's anxiety among families, which is exacerbating these inequities. Those with means have been able to set up a pod. Those who do not have the means are in a different situation, are often those families of color and low-income families that are most at risk of getting COVID, of dying from COVID, who are frontline workers who need their kids to go to school. I mean, it's really exacerbated the inequities on top of the access to technology, to the internet. So there are all sorts of issues. And then there are groups that are looking to take advantage. I mean, there's this disaster capitalism where they're going to be pushing for online vouchers. They're going to be pushing their groups online, their Facebook groups. There are new groups that are pushing to get school board members elected who really want to fund alternative methods and not our public schools. So it's a bit of a mess. Things we can do right now while we're still in this first issue of funding is Just Funded had a petition that a lot of you probably signed. We had about 3,000 signatures. I sent it to the governor and to the heads of both the appropriations and the public education committees. Crickets, nothing from anyone, but basically saying right now they are saying they will fund our schools for the first 4 weeks at the full hold harmless level from last year. But after that, you need a special approval from the commissioner alone, who has a ton of power, who is appointed by the governor, to decide whether they're going to fund the schools. And I just an hour ago listened to the Texas Tribune Festival discussion where they spoke with the chairs of House Public Ed, Chairman Huberty and Larry Taylor from the Senate. And they said, well, if you're not going to go back to school, you're saving money. We're not going to give you all the money. And if your kids aren't enrolled after the first 4 weeks, don't think we're going to send you all that money. You're not paying for electricity. So for one, it costs more to educate in person, online, hybrid, do it all. But there's a serious risk if we do not enroll our kids while we're doing whatever else, that there will not be funding when it comes next time. It's important to vote, and we're going to talk about how leaders at every level affect education. And then I'd love it. I mean, if you all can join Just Funded, there's well, we can post the link later and send it out, but we need more advocates. I mean, they need an army of people, and you need to call your friends and family across the state because, you know, the People's Republic of Austin, they don't all listen to us. The Texas Capitol looks very different than Austin, and legislators need to hear from people in their own hometowns as well. And so one other thing I will mention when it talks about funding before I move on to the next step, and we'll talk to some other issues later when we get to charters about how that's affecting funding, but I did listen to an interview also with the Texas Tribune, and you should all follow the Texas Tribune. It's fantastic reporting on public policy, but they interviewed the comptroller a couple months back and said, what's the deficit looking like? And they said, well, we thought we had this $11 billion deficit. We really only have about a $7 billion deficit because we found $4 billion. $1.2 billion from the CARES money for public ed, $1.7 billion from increased property tax, $700 million from increased recapture, and then the other $700 million was from some other thing. But pretty much $3.5 to $4 billion of that came from public ed, which they're hanging on to. So we need to tell them they already have our money, that they can't take anymore.